Hi, Erin. I just wanted to have a conversation with you about authenticity and just showing up as yourself. I know that when I was reading the chapter of the book, Beautiful Chaos, it was just so wonderful to just see you show up and be vulnerable and then to see you in the launch too. That's what drew me to your story in the first place. So I would love to know, like, how do you just show up and just be your authentic self? And what does that even mean?
Wow. Oh, loaded question. Thanks, Ashley. Well, thank you, first of all, for asking me. I'm really honored. And oh gosh, the launch, yes. Um, this chapter it was definitely me stepping into an incredibly honest space and an authentic place for me. So what you saw at the launch, those emotions were just, I was so overwhelmed with the fact that my story and something that I had guarded against for so long and protected was going to be out into the world. And trying to show up authentically when you have been inauthentic for so long is such this clash of two worlds. And I think that's what was happening there was that the inauthentic part of me, whom I've been the majority of my life, was trying to protect the authentic me, which was who I was when I was being what I wanted to be, doing what I wanted to do in my life. So it was emotional, and it has been the most growth that I think I've experienced. But showing up authentically for me is trying to push away the shoulds and what we've been programmed, whether it be society or our families or our friends, of what we should be. And really getting in touch with myself and thinking, what do I want? And it sounds very simple, but it's such a hard concept because
Mhm.
you have to then out loud say what you want. And there's the vulnerability, right? What if this isn't accepted? What if somebody thinks what I love and want to be is stupid? Or so you're opening yourself up in that vulnerable way. But it wasn't serving me anymore to be inauthentic. It was actually causing more damage in my life. So with a lot of therapy, a lot of
Mm.
therapy, um, and just a lot of permission given to myself and courage, strength, learning about myself. All of these things all had to happen, and they didn't happen overnight. This has been 5 years in the making. So it took a lot of work to get to where I am now, where I mean, I don't really care what people think.
Yeah.
Which that's huge because
Oh,
that
yes.
was not who I was. How I looked, how I was perceived, was everything to me. And now, I mean, I'm just me. And if you don't like it, well, oh well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
So-
think you brought up like the really great point of it's messy. It's not like that overnight thing. Because I know so many women are like, well, how did you do that? Did you just like decide that you're going to change your life and just run? And I'm like, no, I had the tears, the cries, the therapy, the
Yeah.
vulnerable moments with friends, the what am I doing with my life moments too.
Yeah.
And it's really pushing forward. And I think it's because it's so programmed in us too that sometimes we just have to accept they're going to flow in, like whatever those thoughts are of I should, I must, I ought to do these things. But when we really like find our own voice and we just show up, the weight that you were talking about that just like kind of dissipated, right? Like it's a whole different world. People see that in your energy too, right? Like so many times that I talk with people that feel crushed, they're
Yeah.
just like, ah, and then you see the people that are like, ooh, I'm free to just be me. And it's just so much more fun too. I imagine you can say the same about that part.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a lot of energy being something that you're not. And a lot of us don't know that. You don't get that introspection unless something maybe really big happens. And that might be that whatever it is that you're doing that's not authentic starts to catch up with you. And I do believe that it does. I think that the authentic you is screaming all the time to come out. It's just we're not programmed to listen. And we as a society are trying so hard to be what we should be, as you said. So um it's not easy. And I think it's just getting enough courage and pushing your fear aside, even if it's for a hot minute, just to kind of go, what do I love? What do I want? And then that's okay. That was enough. You had a few moments and then you carry on, but keep revisiting it. And slowly but surely, it starts to feel a little bit better. You might say, I don't know that I want to do this forever. I mean, that's scary. If you're in a job where you're like, I don't think this is aligning with me, and then you just whisper that, I don't think this is for me. That in itself is a huge hurdle. So to take those little wins and then just keep building on them and keep moving forward and allow yourself to dream. Because I mean, I'm 50 this year and I have completely transformed my life. And so if I can do it, anyone can do it.
Yeah. I think you brought up a great point because I think sometimes people just get stuck in those narratives of, well, I'm a certain age now and I can't do that, right? So, for myself, I just turned 30 and I remember like in the 20s, it's like, nope, when you're 30, you have to have your life solidified and like everything's figured out. Get there and I'm like, oh, no, I'm still learning and growing and evolving. And I think giving yourself permission to be able to just not be the same version of you that you used to be. Um, I would be curious, like, how did you manage that fear of becoming your next self while also maintaining relationships in your life too? Because I know that our like friends, our family, colleagues, just everybody, if you try to branch out and you're trying to be someone that you haven't seemed like to them, you're trying to be yourself now. But to
Yeah.
them, they saw the inauthentic mask on face. How do you push past all of that and just not let them influence you? Because I think that's a
Yeah.
little bit different than just an average Joe on the street kind of thing.
Oh, for sure. And it's literally terrifying. I remember I went to a retreat in Brazil and I remember thinking, what if I come away from this retreat and I realize that the life I've built for myself doesn't align with me anymore? And it was horrifying and terrifying and so scary. Um, but I think I just got to a point where living the way I was living wasn't working. And it was causing so much stress and anxiety in my life. It was just, there was no other choice. I had to dive in and try and see what would another way look like. And if it meant that people that were in my life at this time fell off, I mean, I look at it like if we're not growing and evolving, then gosh, that would be terrifying. I think we all are. We just don't recognize that we are. Because if you think back to, for me, when I was your age, I'm so different in the last 20 years than I was when I was 30. And I'm so grateful for that because I've gained so much wisdom. Have people fallen off? Yeah, I think that makes sense. Um, because who I was in my 30s, I'm not in my 50s. So if it's if that person was to deserve that time, then I'm okay with that. Um, Setting boundaries and learning to protect my energy, and not being the yes girl anymore and the easy friend. Um, yeah, that was hard because it was scary because I thought no one's gonna like me. It took a lot of work and just I remember the first time I had to tell a friend, no, I didn't want to do something. And it was my therapist and I having this conversation. And I said, I don't really want to go interior camping. And she really loves it. And
Mhm.
my whole life, I would just go along and do whatever my friends liked because I was like, oh, I don't care. I'll just do it. What I realized was, no, no, I cared. I just cared more about being liked and accepted. So I just pushed myself and what I wanted beside. But I would be angry doing things inside. I'd be like, oh my God, I hate this. And then I would get kind of resentful, and then I'd be kind of mad. And then I'd be like, why am I mad at this person? She didn't even do anything. And so it was saying it out loud to somebody that was a safe place, my therapist, and saying, I don't even like interior camping. I'm bougie. I like a five-star hotel with a really cozy bed and a beautiful comforter. And she was like, well, just tell her. And I'm like, I can't. She said, what do
Yeah.
you mean you can't? I said, no, she'd be so disappointed. And it took so much for her to
Mhm.
get me to see I cared more about what she wanted than what I wanted.
Yeah.
And when my therapist challenged me, she said, okay, so before we meet again, you're going to contact her and you're going to tell her you don't want to go. And I was like, oh my God, okay. And this is a friend I've had since I was 17. So the fact that she would leave me is a little silly in my mind, but I really and truly was like, oh my God, we're not going to have anything in common. We won't be friends anymore. I had such a physical reaction before I didn't make the call. I couldn't. I felt sick. I was like, I almost started to hyperventilate. I sweating, all the things. So my body was having that somatic reaction to this fear, to this thing that I was going to do. So I didn't. I was like, I said to my therapist, yep, I failed because I didn't do it. And she was like, you didn't fail, but you thought about it. How did it feel? And we talked about the somatic reaction. And then we went back to it again and again and again and again before
Sounds like
finally,
exposure therapy a little bit
oh,
there.
I was like, I don't want to do it. I think, and then in the end, I said to her, can I text it? She was like, you know what? You can. That's a step. You can text it to her. So that's how I started. And what happened though was that they didn't leave me. They just,
Yeah.
it made most of my friends sad that I had been just going along with them and not living this authentic self. None of them knew, of course. Um, so now they know. And I said, like, so now you know you can help me. When we're doing things, you can ask me, hey, do you want to do this? Are you sure, Erin? Because we're giving you an out. Like, no
Yeah.
judgment. How do you feel? And that helped me. And now I'm in a place where if I don't want to do it, I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing it." So
Yeah.
it's that slow progression. You've been one way for so long. So it takes time. But I think that people expect you to grow and change, and it's okay. And the ones that are meant for you will never leave you. So,
Yeah.
yeah, knowing that if they fall off, okay, so they were meant for this version of me, not this version. So that's okay. And but loss is hard. And so we don't love the idea of that, but that's kind of how I've processed this shift in identity and just knowing that if who I am now means that it's challenging for other people, it's kind of their problem now. Yeah. Took a lot to get here though.
Oh yeah. And as you're talking about everything, I was just thinking about I my background is in psychology. I've had years of experience doing it. And then I switched into mindset coaching, and a lot of the I can't, it's so strong. And it's usually because it's attached to something that's so permanent. Like we tell ourselves if I do X, then it's going to lead to the end of my life of everything I've ever known or whatever. But it's actually just this tiny little shift, like a boat sailing, you're slightly
Yeah.
moving off course of what you used to do. And I think people think it's this big, like, leap of trust off this big cliff. And it really doesn't have to be that big. I know it feels like that in that moment, right? But something that when you're mentioning about your friends and that back and forth of like, well, they felt bad too. I think
Yeah.
about almost all of the time I've ever talked to humans, we always assume other people are thinking so much about like negative things about us, but they're doing the exact same thing. So we're all just walking around worried about what everyone
I
else might think.
know.
And then it's like, well, what if we just showed up as who we are? and gave each other permission. And that's what I heard in that story with the therapist was I think that really just helping you give yourself permission to just be like, how am I going to do this? And finding different options, right? Like I know for myself when I was first single after being in a relationship for 7 years, I was engaged, I was supposed to be married kind of thing. And I was like, this isn't working. And my friends are like, wait, what are you going to do? And you just really have to like take it one step at a time, right? I could have panicked and went, my life is over. But I was like,
Yeah.
nope, okay, so I need to find a department. Kate, next step, next step, next step. And like still allowing yourself to process and grieve those different losses too. Because I think a lot of times, one thing I know when I'm not being authentic in my own life is I throw myself into the next thing as a distraction without actually thinking about like what does that feel like or what do I want to do about it, right? So I think so many people just we avoid those negative feelings and we're like, no, I'm gonna Pandora box it over here,
Yeah.
and then eventually it explodes, right?
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. Yes. Living authentic is not something we've been taught. We're taught by our parents inadvertently, do this. So, okay, without thinking. So yeah, it's not, it's something we're programmed to do. So it's not an easy thing to undo.
Well, and that's what I think about too, like having other people that are an influence on you that help you think about that. So therapy is a great option. Mindset coaches, a best friend who calls you out on your crap and doesn't just
Oh
go,
yeah.
"Oh yes, of course, you were
Yeah.
totally in the right on that." You know what I mean? Right? Like actually being, are you sure you wanted to say that during that conversation?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't sound like something you would normally want to say, right? I think those are so important, or like journaling or something where it's getting it out of our heads because I think that that's part of the chaos is literally if it's in our heads, it just becomes this giant spiral and it's so easy to go, well, I could just go back to where I was. But once you separate yourself far enough from that, like I'm sure for yourself, you were mentioning that you don't care what other people think. You can't really go back to that same version ever again, right? Like it
Yeah.
just feels so gross once you're like, I understand that freedom. Like it is a weight off my shoulders. And how do I let that win again, right? Like why would I want to let that creep in?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it does. I mean, to say that, oh, I don't care ever, that would be a stretch. It still does. It's a default, but I really recognize if I'm doing something that is sort of for someone else. And sometimes I do, but I do it now with intention and I understand it. Whereas before it was coming from a place of trying to be something I wasn't. And so I think you're right. Once you cross over into that authentic space and you start living that way, it's all very intentional and you understand it. You're not doing things based on, yeah, fear and unworthiness and all those types of things. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. So what would be the, I guess, top like 1 to 3 shifts that you've noticed where you're like, this is just the most amazing thing that your life just exploded when you were like, I'm gonna be my authentic self.
Um, Gosh, so many things. I think I've had so many of those aha moments, depending on where it is that I am. I've done many retreats and my background, sort of the job that I've transitioned out of was policing, and that was it's a very, it can be a very trauma-induced job. Um, and once I had unraveled some of the things and had these aha moments, I realized I put a lot of blame on my service and what they did and what things happened to me. And I wouldn't want to say I was in that victim mentality, but a little bit. And when I looked at it and started to really have an understanding of myself and how I play a role in my life, I could see how from the beginning of my policing career right till the end when I left, I mean, I did it all. Yeah, there's a little, they play a little role, so they don't get off scot-free. But the majority of it is me. I allowed all of it. I said yes. I overworked. I, was a people pleaser and overachiever and all those things. So when I realized that, I was like, oh, what? Because that gave me this, I instantly had power. I'm like, I can change it. Like, I can change
It's
it.
like the punch in the face for 5 seconds, and
Right?
you're like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, it's that easy.
Because I thought, how can I change them? Well, I can't. That's an institution that's like rooted in some serious stuff. But when it was me, I was like, oh. Uh, and then once you have that wisdom, once you get that little bit of like, wait a minute, you've contributed to the majority of your A, suffering, B, happiness, everything and in between. Yeah, the power that you have. Well, if I could create all this chaos in my life, I can equally create beautiful space. And so it's that wisdom that when I finally found it, I was like, what is this? And again, it's talking to the right people, having the right conversations. I think therapists are beautiful in that I think there's a misconception they can fix you, they can guide you, and that was the door that got opened for me, and it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm in control of my life, and I had no idea that that was the truth.
And I think you just brought up a wonderful point about therapists fixing people, because in my world, that's a trend I saw was, okay, sorry, excuse my dog snoring in the
Oh, I
background
didn't even
there.
see.
But so when it comes to sorry, where was I at there?
Oh, therapy and like
Distracted.
fixing people.
Yeah. So for the therapy side, so many people will be like, okay, well, this person said this is wrong with me. Please help me fix this. Or society says this, or all of these types of things. And like, just to point out, if a therapist is telling you exactly who you should be and what you're doing, they're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah,
Like, that's
run.
a flag for me of like, no, because
Yeah.
the questions really should be more guiding you exactly what you're talking about to find your voice in that. And I know that's something people get so frustrated about because they're like, well, I was told if I just go talk to a therapist, mindset coach, nutritionist, like any type of title, it's like they'll just tell me what to do and it'll be completely done. And I talk about the miracle really is what happens in your life after the sessions. Like it's not the work that people say in meetings ever. It's teaching you some of the strategies and skills, but it's really that change piece that's really important. And I like as I'm thinking about both of our stories, I'm thinking about oftentimes people sometimes just aren't in a place where they are ready to change, right? And that's where I think talks like this are really important because then it also helps bring that awareness in a different light where it doesn't feel like it's an attack and it goes, please don't make the same mistakes we did.
Yeah.
Like we learned the hard way. We want you to not. But I think
Yeah.
sometimes that big moment really is what breaks that pattern for us, right? Like something big happening in our life. And my hope for everybody is we don't always have to get to the big pattern to be like,
No.
oh, now I'm awake on what's happening in my life, kind of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to hear if you're not in a place that you're aware of wanting to change that, or if you're in fight or flight response too, right? Like
Yeah.
for myself, I worked in crisis work for mental health, very different backgrounds, but still, like I'm sure the escalated nervous system feeling is very similar. The late
Yes.
hours, the shift work, all of that. So how do you or how did you find the time to just slow down, or what did you tell yourself to be able to slow down in the first place? Because that pause is so necessary for everything that we're talking about.
Yeah. I wish I could say that I had the, wherewithal to say, oh, this isn't working and stop. That's not what happened, unfortunately. I was working at 200% capacity. I was overachieving, overextending, saying yes, no boundaries. All of it was rooted in I had wrapped my entire worth around the identity of being a police officer. I was respected, I was looked at as smart, and all the things I never felt that I was my whole life prior to getting into policing. And then I just kept overachieving. And I would think, okay, if I just did this one thing and I would like, I'm going to do that course. And people talk about that person who does that course as they are so smart because it's such a hard course. So I'm like, oh, I'm all in there. So I'd do it. And then I'd be like, huh, I don't feel any different. So it's like, okay, no, that's because that's the baseline. Now I just have to go to the next level and the next level. And I just kept doing that until I got to a place where I describe it kind of like Jenga, where those pieces were pulled out, and that last piece, I didn't see that one coming. It was the piece that literally just the entire thing fell down. So I had a major incident at work that a healthy officer, or had I been healthy, I probably could have been able to work through it. But I was so unhealthy and didn't recognize it. And no one else did. I had a sergeant, who she was such a beautiful soul, and she saw it. But when she tried to talk to me about it, I thought she didn't think I could do it either. I had such imposter syndrome. I was like, oh God, she doesn't think I can do this either. So I didn't even see that she was concerned for my well-being.
You're like,
And
how dare you? Like,
oh, I
don't
was
give me
like,
feedback. Don't attack me
yeah,
right now.
you think I can't do it? Oh my God. So it was like rev it up even more. Um, and then it all came down. And even when I left work that day, I was like, I have to go home. And I left and I had to see my doctor, and my doctor was worried about me. She's like, I've never heard you talk like this. This isn't good. And I was like, okay, I just need a little bit of time, like just a week. She's like, I feel like it's going to be more than a week. And I was like, it can't be. I have 34 reports. I have this, I have that. Like I was like, I have so much work. I cannot leave these open cases. And um you know, she knew me, so she was like, okay, okay. Well, she knew all along. She was like, Erin, I knew you weren't going back. Or I hoped you wouldn't. But she said, I had to go little because I didn't want you to resist it and then run back and get yourself even in more trouble. So thankfully, she was beautiful and wonderful, and she did things really slow with me. And slowly, when I kind of stopped, or forced to stop, yeah, God, it was horrible because I was in such a fight or flight state. I was very elevated, and it really did take a couple of years to get out of that and to be able to accept the therapy that I was doing. So I didn't make a choice. It was made for me. There now, hindsight looking back, oh my gosh, I had 1,000 signs. My body was telling me things all the time. I wasn't sleeping. I couldn't run anymore. I was struggling with my fitness. I felt like my legs were weighted down, like, very drastic mood swings. All the things were there. But when you're around people that are all like-minded and aren't educated in mental health, nobody knew what
It's
was happening.
normal, right?
No, yeah,
Like,
it was totally
it's
normal.
just what we do. We're supposed to
Yeah,
be stressed out and drink 17 coffees to be able to get through the day, right? Like,
right?
it's
Yes.
fine. What are you
Yeah.
talking about?
So it was very and it wasn't intentional it was my body finally just said, you know what? You're not listening. So we're just boom, just gonna stop. And I completely fell apart. So is definitely, I wish I had the foresight, but I don't think a lot of people do. And if you can learn to understand a bit about the subtleness that might happen, and if we can start to educate those people, either our colleagues or, I mean, management, again, a person like me, you can tell me, but I'm like, oh my God, do you think that I'm, failing too? So but it's understanding before you get to that space, seeing the overachieving and the yes people and going, why are they overachieving and saying yes? seeing that as something that's unusual, not something to praise and then also exploit and almost prey on. And I don't think people do it intentionally, but it's having
They're
that,
a hard worker. They love this
right?
stuff. I'm just gonna give
Yeah.
them what they want.
Yeah. But it's having that understanding that, oh, they're the most vulnerable. You know, I used to say, like, oh my God, you have to be working your butt off and you should be exhausted by the end of the day and all the things. And then I would look at some of my colleagues who like do the bare minimum and I'm like, they're so lazy. And now I'm like,
Build
well,
resentment. And then you're like, oh wait, no, you actually understood the assignment. Like you
they
understood what I
have it
should be
figured
doing.
out. Exactly. They're balancing their life. I did not. So, yeah, so to answer your question, I didn't choose it. It finally happens. And now I can look back and see so much. But it took a really big thing for it to all kind of come crumbling down.
Yeah. And I think unless you're that environment where you have those other people for sure, like you don't see it. I saw the same thing happen in my crisis work before, or like I was in grad school working full time during the pandemic, experiencing the pandemic with everybody. And same thing, it started to just crumble, and I was like, ah, right. And for myself, like I chose to take a break from my schooling. So I said, no, I'm going to press pause on my degree for like, I think it was 8 months. And I was
Good.
like, this was one of the best things that I could have done for myself. And of course, the first couple of weeks or like months, I'm like, okay, so I just need to get this project done and this, like, and I would create more busyness in my life. But people were like, how did you do that? And I'm like, because I knew I was at a breaking point where, like, if I pushed harder, I was not going to be okay. My grades were going to slip. Like, I just mentally could not handle that. My relationship, luckily, I don't know if it's luckily would be the right word for it, but it was also falling apart at the same time. So it kind of like forced that, right? So when you're talking about the signs, like, I think about for myself, I'm not super religious, but spiritual. And I'm like, there's always signs of energy of something around us that we're
Hmm.
just not paying attention to. And when I finally started to slow down, I was like, oh, I'm starting to see more of that. Or like being able to see that vulnerable side of other people and realizing that's the emotion speaking, that's not who they are, too. And that's where I look about authenticity because I think about like a lot of the anger I see, or disappointment, or anxiety, or frustrations, or all of that is usually people, or depression too, right? They're not being authentically themselves or showing up that way, and it starts to eat at them. And I think about like just all the joy that comes from when you're being yourself, or the courage, or I know for myself, I'm a very emotional person. So like when I see people cry, I'm like, I get you, like good for you for being able to
Yeah.
express that.
Yeah.
And some of those moments, people take that as me being super frustrated or something else. I'm like, no, like in this moment, it's like that gratitude of the moment, or like just being a human being too, right? And being okay with that. So yeah, I love all the work that you've been putting into to being your authentic self. And I guess for one final question, what advice would you give for women 20 to 40, but in general, any woman I think might need to hear this, of how to just be yourself and really just shine bright in the world around you?
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's hard. Um, it's hard to be yourself. I think having that understanding that depending on how you were raised or what sort of programming you were given, and it doesn't mean you had bad parents because I had great parents, but they did the best they could with what they had. And I didn't know who I was. I was not encouraged to look for who I was. And in sometimes I think I shone through a little bit and it was discouraged. So I think the first thing is just to understand it's not easy. It's not easy to be yourself. And if you're so blessed to have somehow come through and you are being your authentic self and you feel good and rooted, and then that's amazing. But I think to have that understanding that most of us aren't. And we're all kind of moving through the world feeling that way. But thinking about how is it that, like, how do you want to feel in a day? And that it's important. It's important to live your life based on how it is that you want to feel, not how you feel like others want you to be. Um, and knowing that you're enough. So these are huge things that it did take me 5 years of therapy to be here talking about that. So um, if you feel stuck, if you feel like you've gotten into a place where you are doing everything that doesn't feel right and nothing that does, I think that talking to somebody that you trust that will help you unravel that and see that, whether it be a therapist or a coach or a best friend, um, and then it's being honest. And we don't like to be honest about our thoughts and our feelings because we're like, oh God, that's way too
That's
vulnerable.
too
But
real.
if oh yeah, but if you can get some courage and just say it in a safe place and be able to find that place where you can say anything. You can say, like, I've said some things to my therapist that I was horrified that I even thought, but allowing myself to say it. And then her, first of all, her not being surprised, but also saying, huh, okay, let's get a little more curious about why you would feel that way. And then her helping guide me to why. Oh, that's why. And then it just opens this door. So I think my advice would be try to find the courage to be honest. Even if you think what you're going to say sounds terrible, find somebody who you feel like you can talk to and say it because it comes from somewhere. And usually, when you start peeling back the layers, you can find out where that belief came from. And then you can work with it, change it, mold it, make it work for you instead of against you.
I love that so much. Thank you just so much for this conversation. I think this is going to be so helpful for so many women out there who are like, where do I even start with this authenticity thing that so many people are talking about? How do I make this the thing that I want to do and not just another should that I have to add to my plate? So just thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome, Ashley. Thanks for inviting me.